We've seen a 4% decline this year. The outlook for next year is not great in terms of comparisons. We have fewer big franchise films. How bad do you think it's going to get next year?
I don't think it's going to be a critically bad year. I think there's going to be a natural decline, mostly because the Disney slate isn't as strong next year as it is this year. So I still expect the industry to hit that 11 billion mark that it's hit over the last several years.
But one thing that's been interesting about this year is we saw the Disney movies perform. We saw Netflix release 10 movies in September, which has sort of defined the sort of Oscar season. And of course, there's no box office, no measurable box office from those. And then all of these middle movies, sort of middle tier movies, only a handful of them have been hits. Are we going to lose everything with the exception of the big blockbusters of the box office?
Oh, I certainly hope not, especially for future trips to the movies, right? Well, what we really expect in the coming years is for these mid-tier movies to perform better and better. Now, you mentioned a great point about Netflix coming out with 10 titles. But if you look at the titles that they're making, they're not really the sort of big blockbuster hits that even if they had a big theatrical release, I don't think they would have made a huge impact at the box office. If we combine all of the Netflix releases of this year, I think it would be equivalent to around $350 million. That's roughly around 3% of the market, of the domestic box office market. So they could help, yes, but I don't think that the growth of the box office is dependent on Netflix movies hitting movie theaters.
But enough about Netflix. What about Apple? So far, they have been very quiet with their offerings to begin with. And then now suddenly we're hearing rumors that maybe they should buy Netflix in 2020. What do you think?
That's a huge question mark, right? Apple.
They are talking to MGM, we should point out. That's been talked about as well, yes.
That's going to be an interesting conversation to track. Yeah. So as opposed to these other companies that are jumping into the streaming game, Apple is a devices company. They sell phones, they sell laptops. Netflix sells its own content. So do the studios. So for a company like Apple to jump into the fold and really make a dent, it's going to take a long time and a lot of money, a lot of trial and error to do it on its own.
But don't they know that already going in? I mean, these companies are pretty savvy. They know they're going to have to spend a lot of money. They're going to have losses. Even Disney has acknowledged the losses are going to be out there for a while, especially they're charging so little for Disney Plus to begin with right now.
Precisely. But being number two isn't in the Apple culture. That's why I think for Apple to be on the map and to be a leading player, in the short term, it's probably going to require an acquisition.
Now, I want to go back to something you said about this idea that maybe middle market movies will do better next year. Because I think one thing that we've seen a lot about is sort of this investment in really premium content for streaming. You know, The Mandalorian on Disney Plus. One might argue that the availability of that may be one reason that the opening day of this new Star Wars was less than the last two Star Wars. You have all of these really premium shows like the morning show on Apple TV Plus with movie stars in them. And I wonder if at some point you're starting to see not just the content creators move over to streaming and move over to TV, but the money as well. After a year like this past year, when you really only had $100 million hit of these smaller films every quarter, why will studios keep on spending as much on them?
That's a great question. But the way I compare this is a little bit like baseball strategy. If you put in all your money into trying to hit a home run every time you go to the plate, you're gonna strike out more than you're going to hit. I think for all of these studios to stay in the picture, they have to invest in these sort of mid-range movies that'll make 100 million, 150 million. That's going to be integral, hitting these singles and doubles for them to be in the picture. Any studio that will try to be all blockbuster all the time, if you're not named Disney, I think is going to struggle a lot in the coming years.
I was going to ask, I mean, after next year, everybody will be online, right? Among the streamers that are coming out. So who are the haves and have-nots, do you think?
In the streaming space or in the theatrical?
Streaming.
That's going to be a really tough question. I think as we spoke about Apple right now, that's the huge question mark. When do they move? What do they decide?
They've got to buy something to increase their production levels.
Or they could just keep spending money. It just takes longer to increase production levels.
But they need a mechanism to produce those things. You know, it's inefficient to have to go with an individual producer every single time. If you've got a single entity that's producing all these things, it's a lot easier. But you've got our own Comcast Peacock. You've got HBO Max. You know, all these things that are coming online right now.
And don't forget Viacom CBS, which is going to be another mega merger that has a streaming component at stake we're going to continue to see this evolve. I think streaming is going to be a huge story next year. And by 2021, we'll seeing who the buyers are and who the sellers are. But I think we won't be able to know that until we see how this year plays out.
So we've talked about all the challenges for next year with streaming and everything else, but who will be the winners next year? Tell us some of the movies and maybe some of the trends of who's directing those movies that we should look at.
Besides James Bond.
Besides James Bond.
We have a lot of confidence in Warner Brothers for next year. They're rebounding. They have a new chief executive joining the company, Ann Sarnoff, a very influential female executive, and it sort of opens the conversation to more women coming in and directing more movies, more female-driven films hitting the box office. And that not only goes to big blockbusters like Wonder Woman 1984 that's coming out, but you look at a movie like Hustlers from a mid-range studio like STX this year.
Right.
It's an adult-oriented title that did over $100 million. I mean, that's the sort of movie that we're going to need to see come out. And we know the audience is there, and I believe more women are going to be coming out and making these movies, having a leading voice in these movies. And I really think that the future of the cinema industry is going to depend on not only women, but also minority and diversity voices coming in and making content that gets a wider audience.
Absolutely. That's the audience. You got to make movies that tell the story that appeal to that, a diverse audience as well.